It is 2/26 of 2015. We're going to take a look at Robert Jenson again, and we are going to move into another new area that comes up toward the end of his book. He gets into two back-to-back chapters of discussing crucifixion and resurrection, and we're going to take a look at his chapter on crucifixion, which is basically his speculative doctrine of atonement. So we're going to look at his doctrine of atonement in 3 moments. And the 3 moments are basically going to reflect 3 questions which Jenson believes atonement should answer. And those 3 questions are: why did Jesus have to die? How is the crucifixion a sacrifice? And out of what place does crucifixion gain victory over the principalities? So we're going to look at these 3 questions, and by looking at Jenson's response, we're going to learn his doctrine of atonement and how the cross becomes an efficacious act of God's sovereign act of soteria, salvation. So we're going to begin with the first block, which is going to be: why did Jesus have to die? Jenson tells us the crucifixion is the anguish that God undergoes to be merciful within history. It's a closure and an opening as the Spirit rests upon the Son in the moment of abandonment, as the bond of triune love. So therefore, the crucifixion combines 2 specific acts. The first act is the Son's obedient act, but the second act is the Spirit's anticipatory act of the Son being identified with us, the creation. Now, atonement constitutes the following actions. Number 1, lordship. Jesus himself settles on the fact that he is the man for others. 2 is promise. What evolves to word event is the promise of forgiveness out of the Christ event. And then there's the element of testing. In the crucifixion, Jesus Christ's teachings are put through their final test. And then finally, the aspect of being abandoned and raised describes the Father acting in 2 ways, 2 enjoined ways in the Passion of Christ. Now, his major contribution for this doctrine is going to be the second moment. Your mediating moment is usually the moment that has most of the content. And it certainly does here, because this is the question of how is the crucifixion considered a sacrifice. Now, the crucifixion is a prayer spoken in language and gesture. It's a giving over of oneself to love, and in love. It included in a single act all of the petitions from Christ's obedience and his teachings. It is confirmed and accepted as a sacrifice through the steadfastness of Christ's obedience. So Jenson says it is a sacrifice out of the communal fellowship between Father and Son. In the resurrection, there's a change of role for Christ from sacrifice to priest. And then Jenson wanted to point out in this section that during the 1st century, this crucifixion as sacrifice was interpreted in 2 separate ways during the 1st century when the church was evolving. Now, the first interpretation was by James, the brother of Christ, and the Ebionites, and he gave us 5 aspects of this. It consisted of the following triad: the crucifixion was the dramatic necessity of God's plan. 2, it was the fulfillment of the scriptural teaching and the prophetic doctrines of the Old Testament. And then 3, the scribes worked their interpretation of the passion narrative as the fulfillment of Israel's laments. The lamenting of Israel is fulfilled in the passion narratives. And so when these narratives were being written out, the scribes interpreted the passion narratives through this idea of the crucifixion being a fulfillment of Israel's lamenting, Israel's laments. So the key for James and the Ebionites was to establish for the crucifixion a connection to Old Testament Scripture. And Jenson says we can also reference Peter's sermon in Acts 2:23, where he states that the crucifixion and the passion, it was all according to God's plan. Now there are 3 instances of Israel's laments. There's Isaiah 53:7, where we read of the lamb to the slaughter. And there's Psalm 22, for the reference to the cry of abandonment on the cross. Then there's Isaiah 53:7 again, when there's mention of the commending one's life unto the Father. Now the Ebionites linked the passion narrative to the mystery of sin and suffering. So that was one way of interpreting the passion narrative, a very strongly Judaic way of interpreting it, where it is a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy and Judaic scriptures. Now, the second way during the first century of interpreting the crucifixion was through Paul and the Hellenist Christians at Antioch. This was the Greek culture, not the Jewish culture. And from the Greek culture, the crucifixion centered on the concept of reconciliation. The crucifixion was on account of the sin of others, not on the account of prophecy in the Old Testament. The Ethiopian eunuch illustrates the point perfectly, because Isaiah's suffering servant of chapter 53 is referenced, and Jenson tells us that the servant song of Isaiah became the church's first doctrine of atonement. The servant song in Isaiah 53 became the church's first doctrine of atonement. Now, beyond these 2 views of James and the Judaic Ebionite Christians and Paul and the Hellenist Christians, Jenson proposes a third perspective, and he says that he makes 6 points here. Number 1, the crucifixion is a word event taking place within God himself. The resurrection is God's yes to the crucifixion and Christ's ministry. We are to live the passion narrative and rehearse the story of the narrative. Our rehearsal becomes word event. Our rehearsal and recital of the passion narrative creates this recurring word event of the gospel. It's a story of God bringing us back to himself. The church must recite the passion narrative as a Good Friday liturgy. We are to rehearse and recite the passion as a Good Friday liturgy. And that takes us to the third point, where he's going to spell that out under the category of whence, out of what place does crucifixion gain victory over principalities. But the first thing he wants to tell us is there were 2 principalities that were being addressed here in the scripture. And one was the sword of the procurator Pilate, the Roman leadership of Pilate. And the second principality was the Judaic legalism of Caiaphas, the high priest. The Roman principality and the Judaic legalistic principality. They both perpetuated human alienation. Both were overcome by the cross and resurrection. Now, as far as practical steps, Jenson gives us, in this section, the church must continually recreate the word event through 5 elements of liturgy. So he's going to tell us what the liturgy should be composed of. Number 1, it must be a contemplation of the cross. Number 2, Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 are to be read and heard. Number 3, prayer should be offered up, communal and individually. 4, the death on the cross should be remembered in word and sacrament. And then 5th, the crucifixion must be dramatically linked to resurrection. After all, we are to proclaim He is risen. So those are his 5 points. Contemplate the cross, read Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, lift up our praise and petitions in prayer, remember the crucifixion through word and sacrament, and remember to qualify the crucifixion by the resurrection and the statement that He is risen. So it's a very practical, it is a systematic treatment of the Doctrine of Atonement, but he presents a systematic theology almost as a pastoral theology. It's very much could be read as a pastoral theology rather than a systematic theology. But he primarily wanted to point out that the Judaic Ebionite Christianity certainly didn't fully address the Christ event, and the Hellenistic Christianity of Antioch did not fully address the Christ event, and that, as we discussed before, for him, he's a little bit more in tune with Rudolf Bultmann, and he wants to emphasize the fact that the efficacious saving soteria aspect of the crucifixion is best understood as a word event that needs to be a recurring word event, and recurring word event is created through liturgy, through the church liturgy, and the church liturgy has very specific things that must be included, and he gives us those from a pastoral point of view. So he actually transitioned from systematic theologian to pastoral theologian by the end of the chapter, and wants to end with this very praxis-based way of recreating word event out of the Christ event. So it's a further extension of his Bultmannian stance. He's very much in tune with Rudolf Bultmann, but he's very much in tune with conservative Christianity in saying resurrection is certainly part of the temporal passion narrative. Resurrection is part of that passion narrative and qualifies the crucifixion, transforming it into the promise of forgiveness. So he does transcend Ebionite Christianity and Hellenist Christianity, but it's a good point to bring up because he kind of illustrates that the first century Christianity evolved out of conflict, and that it wasn't a birth in Rome, it was a birth in the dialectic and the dialogue that took place between Jerusalem and Antioch. And this dialogue between Jerusalem and Antioch, between the Ebionites and the Hellenists, ended up resulting in a refinement of doctrine concerning the Doctrine of Atonement and concerning the meaning of the crucifixion. So very, very powerful presentation, concise, but again, extremely powerful. So that'll wrap us up for pages 179 to 194, Jenson's Doctrine of Atonement.